How do you see the situation right now in the hottest spots? Because the situation changes every day. Both Pokrovsk and Mirnograd are the number one issue, and that's where I'd like to start our conversation with you. Well, basically, what needs to be understood today is the Pokrovsk defensive operation. The Pokrovsk-Mirnograd operation is ongoing. Today, we're talking about the fact that, in my opinion, we've managed to somewhat stabilize the situation despite the enormous pressure the enemy is exerting in this direction. You know that there are practically 150 to 160,000 enemy personnel concentrated there. However, as Commander-in-Chief Syrskyi confirmed the other day, half of the city, I'm talking about Pokrovsk, is currently controlled by the Ukrainian Defense Forces. Accordingly, the maneuvers our soldiers managed to carry out, which stabilized the front, including getting out of a difficult situation near Sukhi Yar and Lysivka, have allowed us to straighten the front line today. Today, it is clear that the Russians have not managed to change anything drastically, despite the enormous efforts the enemy is making to try to advance both in the city center and accordingly into the northern districts of Pokrovsk. However, they have not succeeded in doing so. Therefore, it is clear that the front line will change and can change. And as I have already said, the enemy's pressure in this direction will not become any less intense. However, we have managed to somewhat improve the logistics for our city of Mirnograd, which is not encircled, not even partially surrounded. And Russian propaganda, of course, is actively working to continue pushing its narratives, primarily spreading them within Ukrainian society, and also sending certain signals to our partners and allies. However, everyone clearly understands and sees that there has been no blitzkrieg here, which in fact has been ongoing for the Russians for almost a year and 4 months now. And Pokrovsk remains under our control, as I already mentioned, about half of the city. That's approximately 13 square kilometers. Accordingly, the actions that the Russians are taking today have not been successful. Another difficult area is Vovchansk. There, the enemy also managed to advance a little through the ruins in which Vovchansk currently finds itself, obviously. I assume that most likely the pressure in this direction may be increased. However, Russian losses today and let's say the Russian units currently in this area are somewhat exhausted. They need reinforcements, they need reserves. I think that the Russian command will try to resume more active combat operations in this direction today. That's why it's also very difficult for our units here, in fact. However, this situation is once again obvious to the Ukrainian command, and the measures that are being taken and have already been taken to further defend these positions are already yielding results today. The enemy overall this time has advanced by about 3 to 4 kilometers. First of all, this is not what the Russians were counting on. Secondly, they do not have the rapid pace of advance in this difficult direction. The situation in Siversk and Lyman is also very difficult. The enemy is not changing tactics and is trying to infiltrate populated areas. Frontal attacks are not bringing them any success. That is why today there are attempts to bypass these populated areas. Well, accordingly, I have already mentioned the attempts to amass forces on the outskirts, because the Russians, as we discussed several months ago in your studio, will try to enter large populated areas during the winter period and get involved in urban combat. However, we see once again that these so-called deadlines are not bringing any success today either. And accordingly, we are talking about Huliapol. The situation there is also very difficult. However, as of today, it has, let's say, been brought closer to a certain stabilization of the front. The Russians no longer have the same pace of advance today. Attempts at infiltration and the buildup of personnel in Huliapol itself have not been successful today. Moreover, Ukrainian defense forces have managed to improve their tactical positions today on the Zaporizhzhia front in the Dnipropetrovsk region. We are not naming the locations today, but our forces have made some progress forward. Accordingly, these counter-attacking actions are producing this result. The Russian army is losing momentum. Still, we expect them to reinforce with reserves. Again, the question is whether these reserves will be brought up in time. It is clear that so-called operational reserves will be used, which were actually intended for completely different actions and directions. That is why in Pokrovsk, Mirnograd, and other locations we are able to hold the enemy back, preventing them from rotating their troops and redeploying forces. In other words, they can't rotate units between directions or reinforce even one of them. And accordingly, we are talking about the Pridniprovsky direction. Here the enemy is trying to attack our islands and the Antonivsky bridges. Given that there has been no success in such advances, artillery shelling of the city of Kherson and the Kherson communities has intensified. The Crimean front is also very active as a result. There is no physical presence of our infantry there, but there are air and sea attacks, respectively. And one of the main topics across the entire front is Kupiansk. These are yet more information psychological operations, EPSO, by the Russian Federation, claiming that Kupiansk has been occupied. However, today the situation is quite the opposite. The defense forces have managed to push the enemy back to the northern outskirts of the city. It's still too early to talk about and probably not worth announcing our movements or efforts in Kupiansk. However, today we can say that the defense forces have regained the tactical positions within the city that had previously been captured by the Russians. The efforts being made in this direction today give us the right, at least for now, to say that Kupiansk has proven to be impregnable for the enemy, despite the obvious efforts we have seen from them. And, in fact, the Russian logistics have not improved. Attempts to move heavy equipment across the Oskil River for attacks on the city have not been successful for the Russians today. The equipment is not being ferried across, the crossings are not operational because the defense forces are also carrying out preemptive strikes.
Serhiy, here's a question. Well, Commander-in-Chief Syrskyi noted that the enemy continues to increase the intensity of offensive actions. And he called the challenges of this winter some of the most serious since the beginning of the war. Right now, the armed forces of Ukraine are facing some of the most serious challenges of the entire full-scale war. I'll repeat this phrase once more. Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine Syrskyi wrote about this on Facebook. According to him, Russian occupiers are increasing the intensity of their offensive actions, so the response from the defense forces must be as effective as possible. And today, the key role in restraining the Russian army belongs to unmanned systems. Let's listen to the direct speech and discuss the details.
At the current stage of the war, it is drones that account for about 60% of all enemy target hits. According to the General Staff of Ukraine, in November alone, unmanned aerial systems carried out more than 304,000 missions, while ground-based robotic systems completed almost 2,000. At the same time, according to the Command of the Unmanned Systems Forces, drones have hit or destroyed about 81,500 targets in total. Over the past 6 months, this figure has been steadily increasing. After a period of relative parity, we are once again ahead of the enemy in the use of FPV drones, one of the main strike tools on the battlefield. At the same time, the development of this area requires even greater coordination, faster decision-making, and a more systematic approach. The enemy is actively ramping up the production and range of UAVs, forming new units and improving their tactics. According to reports from our intelligence agencies, the enemy is aiming to reach monthly deliveries of 500,000 FPV drones to their troops. The Ukrainian response must be asymmetric and effective, intensifying the fight against enemy drones and destroying the infrastructure of the enemy's unmanned forces units. Oleksandr Syrskyi, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Facebook.
And indeed, Sergei, we noticed when telling our viewers about enemy losses that for a fairly long period during the warm season, there were practically no losses of armored vehicles because they weren't being used. But recently, these losses have been increasing. This means we can conclude that the enemy has started using various types of armored vehicles more actively in their attacks. What can you say about this? What should we expect from the Russian occupiers during the winter period?
Well, in fact, we've discussed this point in your studio as well, that with the approach of winter and colder weather, the enemy will use vehicles more frequently. It will be used as a sort of military taxi to transport both personnel and accordingly to try to increase fire pressure on our positions. And the enemy is also trying to take advantage of weather conditions when there are fogs, wind, and our small aviation operates less because drones accordingly can fly less often in such weather. The situation is absolutely the same for the enemy, in fact. However, we see that the Russians really are not increasing the number of UAV crews today across all sectors of the front, and they are scaling up these actions, just as the Commander-in-Chief confirmed the information that they are also trying to ramp up the production of FPV drones. A few months ago, there were reports that FPV drones were already experiencing their decline. However, today we see that it is precisely with the help of FPV drones, among other things, that we can strike the enemy, continue to strike effectively, and in fact counteract their tactics of infiltration, enemy buildup and penetration by small groups, when quite literally it is with FPV drones that we have to flush the Russians out of their hiding places like cockroaches. Therefore, today on our side, we can indeed say that the situation has somewhat improved for us, let's put it that way, though without raising expectations too high. Nevertheless, today, the defense forces have not only managed to restore parity in the sky, in the low airspace, on the battlefield, but also to move forward. However, this cannot, let's say, make us complacent because, as I have already mentioned, the Russians are now trying to increase and build up their capabilities in using drones of various types. We are talking about those drones that are used for logistics. Accordingly, for example, Russian logistics in the city of Kupiansk, for the group that is currently under attack by the Ukrainian defense forces, is using heavy drones specifically to drop ammunition and food supplies to those Russians who have found themselves, to put it mildly, in a very difficult situation. A similar situation is observed in other sectors of the front. So small aerial assets haven't gone anywhere. Weather conditions, of course, will have an impact. However, I think that both we and the Russians will continue to increase our capabilities in using drones specifically. The creation of so-called kill zones is ongoing as well. And I would also like to draw attention not only to FPV drones. We can see the difference in the use of ground-based robotic systems and FPV drones. It's clear that the combat mosquitoes haven't advanced very far yet. However, today, one of the important issues is scaling up the production and use of ground-based robotic systems, because firstly, this reduces personnel losses. Secondly, it is ground robots that are already performing and can perform many more tasks than what they currently demonstrate on the battlefield. This includes logistics, first and foremost, as well as the evacuation of our wounded and unfortunately the fallen, and of course other tasks such as reconnaissance and conducting combat operations. In this area, I believe Ukraine will do everything possible to maximize our capabilities. We already have examples where robots enter into battle and emerge victorious. Of course, they are operated by Ukrainian soldiers.
These are the very images we just saw on the screen. They confirm what you said, Serhiy. Thank you very much for joining us. Serguei Bratchuk, spokesperson for the Ukrainian...
To you, all the best.
Likewise. The spokesperson for the Ukrainian Volunteer Army was with us live on Freedom Channel.
Freedom is now on WhatsApp. Get all the truth.